Living in Oakwood Estates had been mostly peaceful since we moved in 2 years ago. The neighborhood was picturesque with its manicured lawns, tasteful landscaping, and friendly neighbors who respected each other's privacy. That is, until Patricia Winters, or, as most residents secretly called her, HOA Karen, was elected as president of our homeowners association. From that moment on, life in our suburban paradise became increasingly regulated. New rules appeared weekly. Specific trash and placement requirements, approved mailbox designs, and even restrictions on how long children could play outside. As chief of police in our mid-sized town, I typically stayed out of neighborhood politics. I had enough on my plate keeping our community safe without getting involved in debates about lawn ornament regulations or the acceptable shade of beige for exterior paint. My wife Sarah and I had moved here specifically for our 10-year-old son, Ethan. The schools were excellent, and the neighborhood had a reputation for being family-friendly. Every morning, Ethan would walk the short distance to the bus stop at the corner of our street. It was a simple routine that had never caused any issues, until Patricia decided the children waiting for the bus were somehow lowering property values. It started with passive-aggressive community newsletter mentions about unsupervised youth congregating in common areas. Then came the laminated signs posted near the bus stop listing bus stop etiquette that included ridiculous rules like absolutely no sitting on curbs and conversation volume must remain at library levels. Most parents, including myself, rolled our eyes and ignored these unauthorized postings. The bus stop was on public property, after all, and Patricia had no real authority there. I should have known things would escalate. Patricia wasn't the type to accept being ignored. It was a crisp autumn morning when everything came to a head. I was running late for an important meeting at the station and had just dropped Ethan off at the bus stop. There were about 5 other kids there, all standing around chatting as they waited for the bus that was running behind schedule. Nothing unusual, just normal kids being kids. I was about to drive away when I noticed Patricia's silver Mercedes pulling up to the curb. Something about her determined expression as she exited her vehicle made me pause. Against my better judgment, I decided to wait and watch from a distance, my police instincts telling me this might not end well. Patricia marched toward the group of children with purpose, her designer handbag swinging rhythmically with each forceful step. Her perfectly highlighted bob haircut remained unmoved despite the morning breeze. She wore what I'd come to recognize as her official HOA business outfit: pressed khaki pants, a polo shirt with a neighborhood logo embroidered on the chest, and a lanyard with her laminated HOA president card dangling prominently. I couldn't hear what was being said at first, but I could see the children's expressions changing from carefree to confused. When Patricia's voice suddenly rose to a volume that carried across the street to where I was parked, I immediately put my car in park and rolled down my window. "This is absolutely unacceptable behavior," she was saying, her voice sharp and condescending. "You children are being far too loud and disruptive. There are people working from home in these houses, and your screaming is disturbing the entire neighborhood." The kids weren't screaming. They had been talking and laughing at normal volumes. Typical kid behavior that any reasonable person would find completely acceptable. I watched as my son Ethan, always the polite child we'd raised him to be, stepped forward slightly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Winters, but we're just talking while we wait for the bus. It's running late today." Patricia's reaction to this reasonable response made my blood pressure spike. She pointed her finger directly in my son's face, her voice rising even higher. "Don't you dare talk back to me, young man. This is exactly the kind of disrespect I'm talking about. Where are your parents? Someone needs to teach you proper manners." The other children had backed away, looking uncomfortable and even frightened. A couple of them had pulled out phones, likely texting their parents about what was happening. But it was the look on my son's face that made me exit my vehicle, a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and hurt that no child should have to feel while simply waiting for their school bus. I approached the scene calmly, maintaining my professional demeanor that had served me well throughout my 15 years in law enforcement. As I got closer, I could hear Patricia continuing her tirade. "Furthermore, the way you children sit on the curb is damaging community property. The HOA will be sending notices to all of your parents about proper bus stop behavior. I've already drafted a new set of guidelines that the board will be voting on this week. And let me tell you, there will be fines for noncompliance. Good morning, Patricia, I said, keeping my voice deliberately even as I reached the group. The children looked relieved to see an adult intervention. My son's eyes found mine, and I gave him a reassuring nod. Patricia turned toward me, momentarily startled before her expression settled back into righteous indignation. Chief Reynolds. Perfect timing. I was just explaining to these children that their behavior at this bus stop is unacceptable and violates HOA regulations. I smiled politely, though it took considerable effort. I couldn't help but overhear. However, I'm a bit confused about what rules they're violating. They're waiting for their school bus and having a normal conversation. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Perhaps you haven't had time to read the latest HOA newsletter or community guidelines. What with your busy schedule? We've implemented new standards for common area usage, including designated waiting areas like this bus stop. I see, I replied, though I had indeed read the newsletter and knew no such officially approved guidelines existed. But I'm curious, Patricia, under what authority are you enforcing these rules on public property? This bus stop is city property, not HOA common area. A flash of uncertainty crossed her face before she doubled down. This is still within the Oakwood Estates community boundary, and as HOA president, it's my responsibility to maintain standards throughout the neighborhood. By this point, several parents had arrived, likely alerted by their children's text messages. They stood at a short distance, watching the interaction with obvious interest. I could see them exchanging glances and whispers, clearly enjoying seeing someone finally stand up to Patricia's overreach. I understand your concern for the neighborhood, I said, maintaining my professional tone. But there's something important you should know. First, HOA jurisdiction doesn't extend to public property like this bus stop. Second, and perhaps more relevantly to the current situation, you just yelled at and intimidated my son and these other children without parental consent or any legal authority to do so. Patricia's eyes widened slightly as she processed what I was saying. I was merely informing them. No, I interrupted firmly but still calmly. You were yelling at minors and making threats about fines that you have no authority to impose. As both a parent and the chief of police, I find that behavior concerning. The mention of my position seemed to finally register with Patricia, whose complexion paled slightly. The other parents had moved closer now, no longer pretending not to listen. These children were being disruptive, Patricia insisted, though her voice had lost some of its previous conviction. One of the other parents, Michael Chun, whose daughter was in Ethan's class, stepped forward. My daughter was on FaceTime with me just before you arrived, Patricia. They were just talking normally while waiting for the late bus. Another parent nodded in agreement. My son said the same thing. There was no excessive noise. Patricia looked around, suddenly realizing she was outnumbered. Her hand tightened around the strap of her designer handbag. Well, I've received complaints from homeowners about the noise. I'm just doing my job as HOA president. May I ask which homeowners complained? I inquired politely. Patricia hesitated. I'm not at liberty to say. Complainant confidentiality is important. I nodded, understanding perfectly well that there likely were no actual complaints. I respect that. However, as this is public property and these children are doing nothing wrong, I'm going to have to ask you to stop harassing them. Harassing? Patricia's voice rose again, her indignation returning. I'm not harassing anyone. I'm enforcing community standards. Just then, the yellow school bus finally rounded the corner and came into view. The children looked relieved, and I gave Ethan a quick side hug. We'll continue this conversation another time, Patricia, I said as the bus pulled up to the curb. But for now, I think we should let these kids get to school without any more unnecessary stress. The children boarded the bus quickly, eager to escape the tension. As the bus pulled away, Patricia turned to me, her expression rigid with contained anger. This isn't over, Chief Reynolds. The HOA board will be discussing this incident and your interference with neighborhood operations. You may be the police chief, But in Oakwood Estates, we have our own rules to maintain our property values and community standards. I maintain my calm demeanor. I'm looking forward to that board meeting, Patricia. In fact, I think I'll attend. I've been meaning to get more involved in community matters anyway. The gathering of parents around us made no attempt to hide their satisfied smiles at this exchange. For too long, Patricia had ruled our neighborhood like her personal kingdom, and seeing someone stand up to her was clearly a welcome change. As Patricia stalked back to her Mercedes, I turned to the other parents. I apologize for the disruption to your morning. If any of your children felt intimidated or upset by this incident, please let me know. This kind of behavior toward children is unacceptable. Michael Chin shook my hand firmly. Thanks for stepping in, Chief. Patricia's been out of control since she took over the HOA, but this crosses a line. Another parent, Lisa Patel, nodded in agreement. She tried to find me last month because my roses were non-regulation colors. Whatever that means. Pink roses apparently devalue property, another parent added with an eye roll. According to Patricia, anyway. I listened to their stories of Patricia's HOA tyranny, making mental notes. While many of her actions were merely annoying rather than illegal, intimidating children and making false claims about her authority on public property crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I think it might be time for some changes in our HOA leadership, I suggested. The annual meeting is coming up next month, right? The parents exchanged meaningful glances. Are you thinking of running for the board? Michael asked hopefully. I smiled. Let's just say I'm going to take a more active interest in neighborhood governance from now on. For tonight, though, I need to get to the station. But I'd appreciate if you could email me any documentation of HOA overreach you've experienced. It might be helpful going forward. As the parents dispersed to their cars and homes, I headed to the station, already formulating a plan. Patricia had picked the wrong child to intimidate and the wrong parent to challenge. While I had no intention of abusing my position as chief of police, I was fully prepared to use my knowledge of the law to put an end to her reign of suburban terror. True to her word, Patricia wasted no time in escalating the situation. By that afternoon, an emergency HOA board meeting had been called for the following evening. The email notification cited urgent community standards violations and interference with HOA operations as the agenda. Everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly what and who this referred to. When I arrived home that evening, I found an official-looking envelope taped to our front door. Inside was a formal HOA violation notice citing encouragement of disruptive behavior in common areas and undermining HOA authority. The notice included a fine of $500 and a warning that continued violations could result in additional penalties or even liens against our property. Sarah took one look at the notice and laughed. She can't be serious. She's fining the chief of police for stopping her from yelling at children? Does she realize how ridiculous this is? I had to smile at the absurdity myself. Apparently, Patricia takes her HOA presidency very seriously. Too seriously. What are you going to do? Sarah asked, knowing me well enough to see I wasn't going to let this go. Attend the emergency board meeting tomorrow night, for starters, I replied. And I've been doing some research. Did you know our HOA hasn't been properly filing its annual reports with the state for the past 2 years? Or that some of their bylaw amendments weren't properly ratified according to state law? Sarah raised an eyebrow. I'm guessing Patricia doesn't know you're aware of that. Probably not. And I doubt she knows that several of the rules she's been enforcing aren't actually in our official HOA covenants. That night, I made several phone calls to colleagues in the legal department and the city clerk's office. By the time I was done, I had a comprehensive understanding of exactly where our HOA stood legally, and it wasn't on solid ground. The next evening, I arrived at the community center for the emergency board meeting 15 minutes early, dressed not in my usual uniform, but in a crisp suit that I typically reserve for court appearances and press conferences. I wanted to make it clear I was attending as an informed homeowner, not in my official capacity. The room was already half full when I arrived. Word had spread quickly about the confrontation at the bus stop, and it seemed many homeowners were eager to witness the showdown. I recognized many faces from around the neighborhood, including several of the parents from the bus stop incident. They nodded or waved subtly as I entered. Patricia sat at the center of the board table at the front of the room, flanked by the 4 other board members. She was reviewing papers with an intensity that suggested she was preparing for a major legal battle rather than a neighborhood meeting. When she finally looked up and noticed me, her expression hardened momentarily before she composed herself. At precisely 7 o'clock, Patricia called the meeting to order, tapping her gavel with unnecessary force. Thank you all for attending this emergency session of the Oakwood Estates HOA board, she began, her voice carrying the self-importance that had become her trademark. We have some serious matters to discuss regarding community standards and respect for HOA authority. She proceeded to describe the bus stop incident, though her version bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. In Patricia's telling, she had calmly approached a group of excessively loud and disruptive children to gently remind them of community standards, only to be aggressively confronted by me, who undermined HOA authority and encouraged disrespect of community rules. When she finished her creative retelling, she looked directly at me. "Chief Reynolds, would you care to explain your actions?" I stood, buttoning my suit jacket as I did so. The room fell completely silent. "Thank you, Patricia, for the opportunity to address the board and my fellow homeowners," I began, maintaining a professional tone. "I'd like to start by correcting a few inaccuracies in your account of yesterday's events." Over the next few minutes, I provided a factual recounting of what had transpired, including Patricia's raising her voice at the children and pointing her finger in my son's face. Several parents in attendance nodded in confirmation, having either witnessed the incident or heard about it directly from their children. But beyond the specifics of yesterday's incident, I continued, I think we need to address some more fundamental issues with how our HOA is currently being managed. Patricia's face flushed. "This meeting is about your violation, not HOA management." I smiled politely. Actually, according to HOA bylaws, once an emergency meeting is called, any homeowner in good standing may raise relevant community concerns. And I have several. Before Patricia could interrupt again, I pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. I've taken the liberty of compiling some information that I think all homeowners here would find interesting. For instance, did you know that our HOA has failed to file required annual reports with the state for the past 2 years? Murmurs spread through the room as I continued, or that at least 15 of the violations that have resulted in fines over the past year were based on rules that were never properly voted on according to our own bylaws. I glanced at Patricia, whose face had grown increasingly pale, including, coincidentally, the bus stop behavior rules that were allegedly violated yesterday. One of the other board members, a retired attorney named Frank, looked alarmed. "Is this accurate, Patricia? Have we not been filing our reports?" Patricia shifted uncomfortably. "There may have been some administrative oversights, but administrative oversights that technically invalidate many of the board's actions," I interjected smoothly, "including the $500 fine that was left on my door yesterday." The room erupted in conversation as homeowners turned to each other, many sharing their own stories of questionable fines and violations. Patricia banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to regain control of the meeting. "This is completely out of order," she declared, her voice rising to the same pitch she had used with the children. "We're getting off topic." Frank, the attorney, cleared his throat. "Actually, Patricia, I think this is very much on topic. If what Chief Reynolds is saying is accurate, we could be facing serious legal issues as a board." Another board member, Helen, looked concerned. "Have we really not filed reports for 2 years? That's a serious oversight. I have copies of all the documentation right here," I offered, holding up my folder, "including state requirements for HOAs, our own bylaws, and records of which rules were properly ratified and which weren't. I'm happy to share them with the board and any interested homeowners." Patricia's composure was visibly cracking. "This is ridiculous. You're just trying to distract from your own violation because you think your position as police chief puts you above the rules." I maintained my calm demeanor. "On the contrary, Patricia, it's precisely because I respect rules and laws that I'm bringing this to everyone's attention. When rules are properly established and fairly enforced, they benefit everyone. But when they're invented on the fly and selectively enforced, That's not governance. That's harassment. Several homeowners applauded at this, causing Patricia to bang her gavel again in frustration. Furthermore, I continued once the room quieted. I'd like to address the incident with the children directly. Regardless of any HOA rules, real or imagined, no adult has the right to approach and intimidate children who are not their own. As both a parent and a police officer, I found that behavior deeply concerning. More nods and murmurs of agreement from the parents in the room. Chief Reynolds has a point, said Helen from the board table. We've had several complaints about aggressive enforcement tactics recently. Perhaps we should review how violations are being communicated. Patricia looked betrayed by her fellow board member's comment. We have standards to maintain, property values to protect. If people would just follow the rules. What rules exactly? I asked. The ones in our official covenants, or the ones that appear in your newsletters without ever being properly voted on? The meeting continued for another hour, with more homeowners speaking up about their experiences with Patricia's HOA leadership. By the end, the mood in the room had shifted dramatically. What Patricia had likely intended as a show of force against me had turned into a referendum on her leadership. Frank, the attorney on the board, eventually called for a motion to 1. Dismiss all fines based on non-ratified rules. 2. Conduct a full review of HOA governance procedures. And 3. Schedule a special election for HOA leadership positions at the next regular meeting. The motion passed with only Patricia voting against it. As the meeting adjourned, Patricia quickly gathered her papers and headed for the exit, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Several homeowners approached me to share their own stories of HOA overreach and to thank me for speaking up. Michael Chin clapped me on the shoulder. That was masterful. I don't think Patricia knew what hit her. I'm just hoping this leads to some positive changes in how our HOA operates, I replied. Communities function best when everyone's voice is heard and rules are fair and transparent. The aftermath of the meeting unfolded quickly. Within a week, Patricia resigned from the HOA board, citing personal reasons. The rumor around the neighborhood was that her resignation came after a consultation with her personal attorney, who had apparently advised her that her actions as HOA president had exposed her to potential personal liability. At the next regular HOA meeting, a completely new board was elected, with Frank as the new president. His first action was to establish a committee to review and simplify HOA rules, focusing on what was truly necessary for maintaining the neighborhood rather than micromanaging residents' lives. As for Patricia, she kept a notably low profile for months afterward. When she did venture out, she would cross the street to avoid encountering neighbors, especially me. Eventually, we learned through the neighborhood grapevine that she had put her house on the market. The final chapter came about 3 months later, when I received an unexpected email from Patricia. It was brief and clearly difficult for her to write. Chief Reynolds, upon reflection and legal advice, I recognize that my actions toward your son and the other children were inappropriate. I also acknowledge that many of my actions as HOA president exceeded my authority. I offer my sincere apology and assure you nothing similar will occur in the future. Patricia Winters. I show the email to Sarah, who raised an eyebrow. Do you think she means it? Or did her lawyer make her send it? Probably a bit of both, I replied. But either way, it's progress. The following weekend, we saw a moving truck in front of Patricia's house. By Monday, the sold sign appeared on her lawn. The new owners were a young couple with twins just entering kindergarten. The bus stop is now a friendly gathering place again, with children free to talk and laugh at normal volumes while they wait. Sometimes I still stop to watch for a few minutes after dropping Ethan off, appreciating the simple normalcy of it all, and the valuable lesson my son learned about standing up to bullies, even when they're adults with official-sounding titles. As for our HOA, under Frank's leadership, it has transformed into what it should have been all along, a helpful community organization rather than a vehicle for one person's power trip. The annual block party is approaching, and for the first time in years, there's a genuine sense of neighborliness in Oakwood Estates. Sometimes, standing up to the wrong person at the right time can change an entire community for the better. And sometimes, An HOA, Karen yelling at the wrong child, can lead to the positive changes that everyone needed, but no one knew how to initiate.